Caring for Kids God's Way, a biblical counseling certificate program in child advocacy developed by the American Association of Christian Counselors through Light University. Your ministry is to be a Galatians 6:2 helper. Ours is to equip you with the highest level of advanced training from the world's leading Christian counselors. 24 experts teaming up to create the most comprehensive child studies curriculum for the personal classroom. May the Lord bless your study as you begin caring for kids God's way. Co-authors of the Handbook of Group Play Therapy and Childre, a practical manual. Caring for Kids God's Way presents Doctors Linda Homeyer and Daniel Sweeney, connecting with kids through the world of play.
Linda and I are here to talk about play and play therapy. And for us, play therapy is really the same as child therapy, because play is the child's world. Play is children's domain. Children throughout the world play. Linda and I have had opportunities to travel internationally, and wherever we go, we have the experience of seeing children play. The toys differ, the games differ, but play is an international language. And so for us, working with children, if we were to work with children the same way that we work with adults, that wouldn't work right. That would be any of us doing therapy with a client who speaks another language, because children's language is play, and that's really what we want to talk about today, about how play therapy involves play being the language of children. And one of the things I was talking with Linda earlier about was that I had an experience when I went to a play therapy conference, actually, in Nashua, New Hampshire, and I went on a tour of the beautiful trees in New Hampshire.
Yes.
And it was just
in the fall.
In the fall. It was just
right.
incredible. And I thought, gosh, where do all these colors come from? And they're just magnificent. And I'm sure there's a wonderful botanical explanation. I don't know that. But for me, it's God put something in those trees that when the climate changed, they changed. And for me, play therapy is kind of like that. What we're doing is trying to provide an environmental change for children, giving them the opportunity to speak in their language, and then what God has placed in them comes forth.
And I think that is really what we hope to do today, is to talk about why it's so important to use play as a way to really enter the child's world and get a chance to really talk to them in their play language, and how do we then understand it as an adult and then be able to share that with other adults in the child's life, parents or school teachers and that kind of thing. So how do we really talk about how do you take play language and then to kind of translate it into adult language to be able to share with parents how we're working with their children. So we hope after the session today that people will have a lot more information about doing that.
Yeah. And one of the ways I look at play therapy too is play therapy is really true empathy. Empathy, basic counseling skill,
Right.
involves entering the world of your client. And when I think about empathy, I think the greatest act of empathy ever was the incarnation.
Exactly.
Was Jesus Christ entering our world. And I just have this idea, I know you share this, if it wasn't below Christ to enter our world, that great act of empathy, then maybe it shouldn't be below us to enter the world of children. And so that is crucially important to do that.
And I think it can be scary I know both of us teach in counseling programs, and I know it can be real scary for my students initially to give up all the questioning and all the talk and verbal interaction and really allow children to play and express themselves through the play. And so that sense of leaving what's comfortable for me in my realm and getting into the realm of children is a great parallel, I think.
Yeah. And there's a number of things that play reveals. I think child's play reveals what they've experienced. Then also it reveals their feelings, their behavioral reactions to what they've experienced. And then also I think play reveals what a child needs in his or her life. And then also I think this is really crucial, and this by the way is both in play therapy, but just also in child's play in general. It reveals their self-concept, what they think about themselves.
And I think that's important, is that children use play anyway. We see kids play at home, we see kids playing on the playground, and so we just naturally know that children play. I mean, we know that play is important for just normal, healthy growth and development. In fact, that's one of the ways they test children to see if they're on track developmentally, very young children, is how they play. And so we know that play is very crucially important for normal growth and development. And so to me, play therapy just extends that when children have a life experience that takes them off track developmentally or somehow interrupts their normal development in some way, that play therapy then is a way to get them back on track developmentally.
Oh, and we see that historically as well. I mean, children use play to make sense of their world. There's documented evidence of children playing in Dachau and Auschwitz. And that would seem, why would children play there? But that's how they make sense of even awful things happening in their world. Zechariah 8:5, for instance, mentions that, talks about the boys and girls playing in the streets of Zion. So even Scripture recognizes that play is simply the natural activity of children. Although one thing we need to think about when we talk about play is not the same as I think often adults look at play. I think sometimes adults look at sports, for instance, as play. And there's a play element to that, but of course with sports, there's competition.
Yes.
And with true play, there's no evaluation, there's no competition. It's pleasurable, it's spontaneous. There's no evaluation or judgment of the play. For instance, I don't interpret a child's play in play therapy. I haven't had a child ever come to me and say, "That was a wonderful interpretation, Dr. Sweeney."
You haven't, huh?
Because the interpretation really belongs to the client.
Yes.
And there are times when children will play things out and I won't understand what's happening in the playroom. Yet because of what I'm communicating to the child and they're speaking in their own language, they're able to process a myriad of things.
And while it's pleasurable, I think even normal children out playing also use it as a way to relieve the stress of a day at school or stressors in the family. So even though it is pleasurable and self-directed, normal play, just childhood play, sometimes they may as well be dealing with issues in their normal life with all the different kinds of stressors and problems that they might be encountering in their day-to-day life.
Sure. And one of the things about play and play therapy is that play is person-focused. True play is person-focused, not object-focused. We talked earlier about how the toys and games may differ in different cultures, but really it's about the relationship. And of course, that's the biggest part for us about play therapy is the relationship between the child and the therapist. And so I heard one author say that the best toy that a child can possibly have is the invested and caring adult.
Yes.
And so toys are important. We're going to talk about that. But
right.
But really the fact that it's person-focused.
And I think that is so crucial, is to remember it's the relationship. It's the relationship where often children develop problems from different kinds of trauma. I specialize in working with sexually abused children, so there's obviously major disruption in relationships with that kind of trauma. Children that are displaced from their role in their family, so it can be a wide spectrum. We'll talk more about that this morning. But also it's that whole concept of relationship. So just as a relationship that's been harmed and disrupted might bring a child to therapy, it's also the relationship as a therapist that I have with that child that can also provide those corrective emotional experiences that allow the child then to get back on track developmentally and have some healing.
Now, I have a question. What's the difference between play and play therapy? If I have a parent coming to see me and they're like, "I'm going to pay you how much to play with my child?" I mean, what's the difference between the child's play on the playground, for instance, and play therapy?
Well, I think the crucial part is that play therapists, like any counselor, is trained to really work with the child. And in our way of doing play therapy, which is very child-centered, is to assist the child in understanding what's going on in their world. So as they play out a scenario, then the way that I verbally react to the child and reflect to the child, or role play with the child, let the child direct what's happening, then the child has a different kind of relationship with me than they can have with a parent. For example, with sexually abused children, I often find that they try to do a lot of protecting of their parents because they know if they talk about their sexual abuse or play with their dolls in some kind of a sexual way because they're trying to work out the issue of their sexual abuse, develop some control and mastery, mom freaks out and cries or tells them not to do that. Where as a trained therapist, I can allow them the freedom to do that and work on their issues within the play therapy session. I really am trained then to allow the child to do play where they can develop a sense of control. I think control and mastery are probably the two key issues of what we want a child to develop. Usually some kind of trauma or life event that brings them to therapy has really exaggerated their lack of control. We know children don't really have much control in their world anyway because they're children. And then that sense of mastery, trying to make sense of what has happened to them, take that experience apart and put it back together. And then, so I'm trained to reflect that, almost to take their play language, put it into English, since I'm an English speaker therapist, and reflect that back so that they really learn about and hear what's happening to them, both on an experiential level, and then I reflect that back to them so they hear it cognitively as well.
And when you talk about mastery and control, it reminds me of not really a case that I had, but an example of how children speak through play therapy. And it was my daughter Michelle. And Michelle was, 3 or 4 years old, I don't remember exactly. And we had another baby born in the family. So she started to act out, as children do oftentimes.
Was she the youngest then?
She was I'm not sure which child it was.
Okay.
But,
maybe I shouldn't have asked that.
I've got 4 and I get confused.
Okay.
But she was acting out. Her mom and I were giving attention to the baby, and so I did what any parent does. I disciplined. I gave her a timeout. I sent her to her room, and lo and behold, the behavior continued. But then a bright idea struck me. I'm a play therapist.
Very good.
And so I brought her into the playroom, and I happened to videotape it. And so she's playing, and it's kind of garden variety play. But then I say, we have 5 minutes left in the playtime. And of course, you and I both know oftentimes things, whether with children or adults, a lot happens in the last 5 minutes of therapy. But of course, this wasn't therapy. But she took the doll house, put it in the middle of the room, and then picked out some dolls and said, this is the daddy doll, this is the mommy doll, this is the girl doll, and this is the baby girl. And so she said, the dad is reading the paper. Which, by the way, I took offense to, because I thought, I don't read the paper until you're in bed. But I maintained my therapeutic role.
Very good, very good.
And the mom is cooking in the kitchen. And the little girl is building a house in the backyard because there's no room for her in the house. And I mean, it doesn't take Freud to figure out what's going on. She felt displaced. But, I have never experienced a child coming to a parent saying, Mom, Dad, I'm feeling displaced. The sibling rivalry issues are intensifying, and I could use some intervention.
And you're not giving me as much attention. Now the baby's getting all the attention, and I need some of that attention. So your 3 or 4 year old just didn't sit down and tell you that?
She didn't tell me that. And so, but what she did is she acted out. And again, I did what parents do. I disciplined. And there's, of course, nothing wrong with discipline. But one of the things that we recognize as play therapists is what happens is that when children have underlying emotional turmoil, oftentimes it comes out in either acting out, externalizing behaviors, or acting in, internalizing behaviors. In this case, she was acting out, and I should have realized, being a child therapist, when she was acting out what was going on, but she was able to communicate to me through play. And that is something that happens with children when they come into play therapy. They're able to communicate through play what has happened to them, and they are able to process that. Because if I continued with discipline, then that underlying emotional turmoil, are ignoring her, essentially, which of course wasn't our intent, that would have continued, and I would not have known.
So what did you then, as a parent, do differently now that you had that information about your daughter? What did you do differently in the household?
Well, what I did is give Michelle the attention that she needed at that point. And oftentimes, I mean, the very biggest issue that parents bring their children in for is non-compliance. And so if I were a parent, I might have brought Michelle in, for instance, and said, goodness gracious, she's acting out. But in this case, it was just because of that underlying emotional turmoil. Now, we're not talking about a case of trauma, but it is a good picture of how children communicate through play.
Exactly. And I think what's important there, too, is she was able to actually demonstrate a story, a scenario that followed pretty closely the whole family, although she didn't have all of her siblings in the dollhouse and all of that. Identified enough so you knew that you were the dad with the newspaper and all that. Sometimes my experience in play therapy, too, is children will only act out their emotional response to the trauma. So, for example, sexually abused children may not actually demonstrate in a dollhouse they're being molested, although I've certainly had that happen, but they might act out being vulnerable or being not protected, and their response to their abuse. And so, again, that's what I think how play therapy differs than typical normal childhood play, is I'm trained to understand that and deal with those kinds of issues and give them the freedom and permissive place in order to be therapeutic.
I'm just reminded of, you're talking about sexual abuse, of a case I had, and the girl was about 9 years old, and she had actually been seeing a therapist. And the parents came to me and said, the therapy has stagnated. which is kind of an interesting term for them to use. And they wanted the child to come in and see me. So she came in to a playroom, which was too small, and we'll be talking about playrooms a little bit later. But it was really too small. And so here she is sitting down. She sat down, folded her legs, with a strange person in a small room with a male. And her first thing was, I suppose you want to talk about the molest. It just broke my heart when she did it, because I thought, is that what you think therapy is? Talking about the molest? And I think one thing that therapists make mistakes with children is because they might be verbal, they think, well, we can engage in verbal therapy with them. And they may be very verbal. But really, the emotional issues, I think, get processed on a projective medium, such as play therapy.
Right.
So after I had my moment of being flabbergasted, then I said to her, I said, well, this is a place where you can talk about whatever you want or not talk at all. And then it was her turn to be flabbergasted. She didn't know what to do.
Right.
And she did not play very much in that session. And then second session, she played a little bit more. The third session, she played a lot. Then I got a phone call from the parents after the third session. They said, I don't know what you're doing. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I hope I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But she was not having nightmares anymore. She was relating better at school. And there was nothing in her play that indicated sexual abuse. But I think what was happening is she was able to communicate her needs in a medium of communication that was her developmentally at her level. And I was communicating to the best of my ability those 4 things we talked about earlier.
Okay.
That we train our therapists to communicate to children. I'm here. I hear you. I understand. I care. Goodness, can you imagine being around people who communicate that?
Yeah, it'd be wonderful.
That's therapeutic in and of itself.
Yes, yeah.
And so I was able to do that with her, and there was remarkable change, even though she had previously talked all about the trauma she had experienced.
Right. Because I think, again, it's that emotional response usually to our life events where we're not having our need met. And there are so many basic emotional needs in Scripture that talk about comforting and mourning and all of that, and we tend not to do that with children. You're right, we tend to discipline and we want to change their behavior but not really meet their heart needs in that. Let me move on, and I would actually like to talk about a specific definition of play therapy written by Gary Landreth, who has written the classic textbook of play therapy. And I'm going to read this so I get it correct. That play therapy is a dynamic interpersonal relationship, and that's really what we've been talking about, between a child or a person of any age, and play therapy is used with adults, and family configurations, family play therapy, and a therapist trained in play therapy procedures. So we did want to be sure to mention today that although we hope this gives you a lot of information, that this video is insufficient to train you as a play therapist, because you should have scholastic training as well as clinical supervision in play therapy.
And when I'm doing presentations on play therapy, I'll often use the example. Now, you wouldn't go to an hour-and-a-half workshop on hypnotherapy and then start hypnotizing your clients.
Well, I hope not.
Well, hope not, because
right.
I also teach ethics, because that would be practicing outside of the scope of your expertise. So in the same way, I mean, I think our hope is that this presentation will be will whet the appetite of people who work with children to get further training in play therapy.
But also give you some idea of how to work now with kids you might already have on your caseload.
Absolutely.
And already be working. So it's also, to continue on this definition, a therapist trained in play therapy procedures who provide selected play materials, we're going to talk about more of that, and facilitates the development of a safe relationship for the child to fully express and explore self, just as we do when we talk with adult clients, is that exploration of who we are and what our issues are. But we do that in a different way because we give them the play materials to use. And it's the child's natural medium of communication for optimal growth and development. And to me, that's what's so exciting, and why I really chose to work with children, is to really have that opportunity to help get them back on developmental levels, and so that they can continue to grow and develop in a healthy way that God would have them do if this trauma or life experience that this has obviously affected them hadn't come into their life.
And a couple of words that stick out for me too in that definition, I could probably take an hour picking apart that definition, was facilitates. Because I really believe that in play therapy that our job is to be a facilitator. The child is the director and the choreographer of the play process, and we are facilitators. Just in the same way that I was giving that example about how God placed in those trees what they needed and when climate changed. So when I communicate, I'm here, I hear you, I understand, I care. I think that's facilitating. And then also the word safety in there, because
yes, huge.
it's something that I teach all of my students, regardless of the age of their clients, is that people do not grow where they don't feel safe. So safety is crucial to growth. And so one of my goals is to create a safe place for children to be.
And again, we allow them in play therapy to do things that aren't appropriate in the rest of their world. It's not appropriate in their classroom or might not be appropriate at home, like pretending to kill their perpetrator because they need to regain and be re-empowered, that they have some control. We don't at all believe that they're going to go out and try to kill somebody, but it's that allowing them in fantasy what they can't have in reality. They can't have that control over their perpetrator. So giving them a chance to really express themselves in lots of ways. Their anger, which might be expressed in ways in the playroom, just like with adult clients who can say things and express themselves in ways that you wouldn't expect them to do with their next door neighbor, because they're in therapy, so they get to do things differently.
Sure.
Why don't we move on and talk about the playroom and toys?
Okay.
So they have an idea what this is all about.
All right, we have some with us that we can look at. There's really 3 basic categories of toys, and this again is in Dr. Landreth's book. And this book will be on the bibliography that you'll receive with the written materials with this tape. The first category being real-life toys. And I think we have some here. Certainly the baby bottle and the
medical
stethoscope,
kits and those kind of things, right?
And animals and puppets. Also, the next category being acting out aggressive release toys.
How about this two-headed dinosaur?
That could be. That's a little scary looking. And so it also might be an inflatable bop bag that you can release emotion on. That it can be abreactive. Also, handcuffs we have there, and we also have toy weapons in the playroom. As I said, children can act out in fantasy what they're not able to act out in reality. I had one of my first cases in play therapy. A boy about 10 years old. He came into the playroom and he went ballistic. You know that clinical term.
Yes, ballistic.
And he went ballistic.
Yeah.
And the toys were all over the place, and I thought, oh my goodness, he's going to go back into his classroom, and he's going to go nuts. This is in the therapeutic foster care setting I was working in, and he went back and had his best afternoon in school that he'd had for months and months and months. Because I think what was happening
I've had similar experiences,
is that it isn't that children get all jacked up in the playroom and then go out. They know that this is a room. This is a place. These are toys that I can do this. This is a person whom I can do this with.
And it's safe to do it.
It's safe to do it.
Right.
And so actually what we find is that acting out behavior decreases when children have that experience, not increases.
Right.
And so it's important to have those acting out aggressive release toys.
As I'm holding these, I remember a little girl that was sexually abused. I had this huge wolf puppet, a full-size animal puppet. Not full-size to a wolf, but I mean it was a complete animal. And she would come in and she would handcuff his 4 legs together. And she used that big wolf puppet as the symbol for her perpetrator. And after she had him handcuffed and in jail, then she was free to do the rest of her therapeutic work. But I think that was part of her sense of not just empowerment and control, but also this is going to be my safe place to do the work I need to do because I've got the perpetrator where he can't hurt me any longer. So they use them in lots and lots of creative and different ways. I've also been handcuffed, so.
And it was reminding me of a case I was just showing on a videotape where the child had handcuffed me. Never behind your back, of course, but handcuffed me in front. And these handcuffs have a quick release. They look kind of real, but they have a quick release on them. And what this child would do was session after session, he would handcuff me. And in this particular session I'm thinking of, I hadn't seen him for 2 weeks, or maybe 3 weeks actually. And he came in and he handcuffed me, like actually he usually did. And then right after that, he gave me a hug and said, "I missed you." And it was just real poignant that he wasn't able to do that while I wasn't handcuffed. And of course, he had the experience of being actually straitjacketed in the past and restrained. He knew what it was like. And so I think part of what was happening in therapy was, here's what's happening. Here's what I've experienced. I want you to know what I've experienced. And then also, of course, you got to control me.
Exactly. So other categories.
So there's 3 categories: the real-life toys, the acting out aggressive release toys, and then the creative expression and emotional release toys. And that can be something like Play-Doh. It can be sand. It can be markers, art materials, so the child can be as creative as he or she wants to be.
They can also be things like dress-up toys, dress-up costumes. I've got just this big, huge piece of black fabric, and that's been used from everything from a judge's robe to Batman to ninjas. So very creative and expressive, the way that kids can use that in lots of different kinds of ways.
I managed to get a black middle school commencement gown.
Yes.
And that is used frequently as a judge for children in custody cases or foster care or things like that.
Because the judge has all the power in their life.
And so
then a playroom, we have all of these toys, but if we're lucky enough to have a special playroom, as I am able in my private practice, the toys are always in the same place so that the children are, they come in with that internal or external chaos, but they always know where the toys are, so they know exactly. One of the phrases we use in play therapy a lot are toys are their words and play is their language. And if toys are their words, we want them to be able to find them. And so the nurturing toys are always in the same place. The dollhouse and the dollhouse figures are always in the same place. Aggression, always in the same place.
You wouldn't want to put a little baby doll at the foot of this scary two-headed dragon here, because an emotionally fragile child might not be willing to go there.
Right, too scary. Yeah. And we've probably both had the experience that some of those emotionally fragile children come in, and it's as if they don't even acknowledge or not even aware of all the aggressive toys. And then later in therapy, all of a sudden they start using them, but initially it's too scary for them to do that.
Now, if you are fortunate enough to have a playroom, and we'll talk about some alternates in just a moment, a couple of things that are important. We certainly don't want a playroom that's too small.
Exactly.
Or too big.
Right.
If it's too small, it can be confining, it can be scary for a child to be with a stranger. If it's too big, a child can hide. It can be even emotionally flooding for a child, and
also allows them too much opportunity to disconnect and not to develop a therapeutic relationship.
So it's wonderful if you can have a tiled floor, because paint is easier to take care of.
And a big sandbox.
A big sandbox would be wonderful. One of the things that we'll show on this tape are some pictures of some sample playrooms to get a kind of an idea of what one looks like.
Additionally, though, I know I have several colleagues, like school counselors, who don't have the luxury of a set-aside playroom. So they have maybe shelves with the toys set up in certain categories, and then maybe even a curtain across the top with Velcro they can cover when they're not using it as a play therapy room, take it off when they are. We both know people that do in-home therapy, and they have a traveling play therapy kit in a wheeled suitcase and take in toys and set them up in a room in someone's home. So there's lots of flexibility in how the playroom is set up, but always, even when a travel kit, that toys are set up in the same place in the same room, using it like a couch for a shelf and the floor for another shelf, but ways to give the child room to use those gross motor skills and actually work around through an entire space rather than being confined to a table, for example.
Well, and right now, actually, that's what I do in the practice that I have. Is that I don't have a play therapy room, unfortunately, and so I have a box of toys. Kind of the box that computer copier paper comes in. I flip the lid, and then I have drawn a square, and that's my dollhouse. And I have some plastic doll furniture, and so there'll be a list of toys in the printed material that people get with this videotape. And just a few more comments about toys before we move on. The toys really need to allow success without prescribed structure.
What would be an example of a toy that you wouldn't use because it's too structured?
What I don't use, so what some child therapists use, I don't use games. I use games with adolescents and adults sometimes, but what I find is that games, for one thing, they promote competition.
Exactly.
They promote relationship, and I'm interested in promoting relationship. It's hard for me to figure out the therapeutic value of Candyland. Because oftentimes what therapists will do who use games is they'll try to lose so that the child can win. Children are so good at picking up on that, and they figure that out. And so I'm interested in toys that allow for that, for non-committal play, for creativity, that can allow exploratory play and expressive play.
And I think that's crucial. I think it's also allowing enough creativity so the child can put their meaning on the toy. That's why, like, for example, play cell phones. Well, first of all, I just use my old cell phones that I've no longer using.
And I do too.
But some people use the play cell phone, so when they push a button, then they hear mommy talking or whatever. But I take out the battery, so because I want the child to do the talking. I want the child to make up the story, so that if they want to pick up a phone and yell at their mother for not protecting them, or yell at their father for molesting them, that they don't have this sweet little tinkly sound in the background. So
or they call up and nobody answers.
Right.
With just a picture of that's the type of experience they have at home.
Right. So again, where the child can put their meaning and expression into the toy, so that it's not pre-prescribed. So what else do you have?
Well,
about
generally,
toys?
generally also generic toys. I mean, there's a lot of toys that are related to children's TV shows, and there's wonderful toys, but I don't actually have them in the playroom. I don't want to have a toy that is already laden with meaning, for instance, a violent meaning of some type. If a child wants to express violent or aggressive feelings, that's not a problem, and there's plenty of toys that they can do that. But toys generally are generic. And then as we talk in a moment about the therapeutic process, we don't identify those toys. If a child picks up this toy, I'm not going to identify this as an alligator, because this could be anything. This could be an airplane. If I identify it as something specific, then that's all it can be.
Or it could be Uncle George.
It could be. It could be anyone. And if,
That's right.
And even if I ascribe gender to it, then I'm taking over and not allowing the child. And so generally generic toys. But I want to move on. I want to ask you a question. What type of children would you see in play therapy? What type of presenting problems?
Well, I think that's the real bonus of using the child's world of play, is you can see a child that has almost any kind of presenting issue. So it might be someone who has already had a diagnosis of a mental illness, like anything from conduct disorder to oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD. I mean, a lot of those serious attachment reactive disorders, a lot of those labels that get put on children, as well as you were talking about your own daughter. It could be simply a child having a hard time adjusting to a new member of the family, certainly step parents and blended families. That might be an example of the time to do family play therapy and have the whole family together. It could be a child I've had a child who was attacked by a dog, bitten badly on his face and his chest. Interestingly enough, his therapy was more about his parents' reaction and actually going to the hospital and all the medical procedures than the actual dog bite. So, but anything that interrupts a child's normal functioning, when I think it's that extreme, like if the child's been doing well in school and is now not doing well. They had been sleeping well, they're not sleeping well, they're having nightmares. They had been eating, they're not eating. Or maybe they're eating way too much. So anytime typical behavior moves to an extreme, I think is a time to look at, maybe this is a time for some kind of professional intervention.
Well, and you're right, there's a wide variety. I've had clients with trichotillomania, with that compulsive hair pulling, with the childhood schizophrenia, with major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder. It's because as we were talking about before, what we're looking at is getting below the behavioral expression, that either that acting out or that acting in. And actually, I find that acting out behaviors are easier to deal with.
Yes.
They're oftentimes more visible to adults, but acting in behaviors like anxiety or depression, sometimes those aren't seen, those aren't recognized by parents. So it is a wide variety.
And so are we saying to our audience here that play therapy is the only thing these kids will ever need?
Oh, absolutely not. Play therapy is an important, I would say play therapy is crucial for all children. However, we were talking earlier today about ADHD. Now, if it's a true diagnosis, now that is a big if. If there's been an accurate assessment, then absolutely there needs to be a psychopharmacological intervention. There needs to be some medication. But I'm not aware of any medication that helps with self-esteem issues. And I'm not aware of any ADHD child who doesn't have self-concept problems, have been ostracized by peers, by parents, by teachers. And there's no pill that takes care of that. And so I think they need a psychotherapeutic intervention. And for me, that would be play therapy. And then also a behavioral intervention. I think a token economy, perhaps, in the home would be a helpful thing to do. So there's a number of interventions, but I wouldn't say play therapy is all an ADHD child needs, but I would say that he or she does need that.
And I think what we're also saying is that every child and every family needs to be looked at individually. And so some kind of a treatment plan or intervention plan needs to be unique to that family and needs to be unique. Because I know even working with a lot of sexually abused children, that each child responds different to their particular abuse, and every child may be different in how they react to that. Parents react differently. some of them cope very well and are very healthy, but sometimes it's the parent who needs a lot of therapy. And because of their guilt issues or their belief that it's their fault that they put their child in a position where the abuse happened, or they can no longer look at their child without seeing them as an individual who's been molested, and they see that activity in their mind. So often we need to deal with each family as a unique component, so some will need lots of different kinds of intervention.
Some may involve parent training, as you were mentioning. Some may involve marital therapy.
Yes.
It may be that a child is reacting to some marital dysfunction. And I think play therapy would be helpful for that child. But for me, I would say my first intervention I would want to do would be couples therapy. And so I'm sold, as you are, on play therapy, because play is how children communicate. But as far as the entire treatment plan, and when you mentioned treatment plan, it made me think about the treatment planning class that I teach. And treatment plans can be written up very behaviorally, using play therapy, using a multidisciplinary approach. And so play therapy is recognized by the mental health community and by managed care as a credible intervention. And we hadn't talked about mentioning this, but I think one thing, and we'll put the reference in the written materials, is that a meta-analysis was done on play therapy studies, finding an effect size of 0.80, which for many therapy studies it's more around 0.65, 0.67, 0.7. And so play therapy has been shown to be an effective intervention.
Right, there's a great deal of research, and again, we'll put that in the printed material where you can find that article and find that information, because for many of us that kind of research-based treatment is very important in the various settings in which we work. So we'll provide that information as well.
So let's talk about what happens in the playroom.
What happens in the playroom?
So I think that's an important thing to talk about, what therapists do, what children do. You talked about our approach being primarily child-centered. Now, what would that entail in the playroom?
Well, I think it's important to know that just like, say, with group counseling, different kinds of theories of counseling can be applied. So you might do cognitive behavioral play therapy. You might do what we call child-centered, which is by Virginia Axline, which is Rogerian, Carl Rogers, person-centered, applied to children. You could do Gestalt play therapy, Jungian play therapy. There's lots of different theoretical applications into play therapy. But you and I...
We'll add a reference to
yeah, we'll
that
add
as
all
well.
those references to the material. But you and I both are very committed to the person-centered. Again, I think because we are crucial about the relationship, and that God made us as relational people, so relationship is that key component for healthy, effective functioning in this world.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So, so we really let the child then take the therapy where it needs to go, is what we typically say.
Yeah.
And we really trust that whatever is causing the child distress, if we establish the safe environment in the playroom, the child almost has no choice. Like a tree in the fall has no choice to turn colors, the child almost has no choice, but is then free to express what their issues are.
For instance, one of the things, with behaviorally acting out children that we do is we set limits, but only when they're needed.
Yes.
We don't start off the therapy session by saying, you can do this, but you can't do this, you can't do this, because we want to create a permissive environment. And if limits are needed, then we will set limits when they are needed, but not until that point, because a dissertation of what you can and cannot do does not create safety, and that's, as I said before, what creates growth.
Nor is it very freeing, nor is it very relationship building if the first time I meet you I tell you everything you can't do in my presence. So.
One of the things I don't do, and I think it's important to mention this, is I don't ask questions, which is a very different way of doing therapy.
That's right.
Therapy is oftentimes all about asking questions and how does that make you feel, and probing. And I don't know if that there's anything wrong with that with adult therapy. But one of the reasons why I'm primarily child-centered, and I could talk about some other theoretical orientations as well that kind of shape who I am, but is that I believe that developmentally it's the most appropriate thing to do with children. One of the reasons why we do play therapy is they don't have the abstract thinking skills. They don't have the cognitive verbal skills to engage in therapy like adults do.
Right.
And so if I were to, I often do this in training, if I were to ask, let me ask you right now, Linda, what did you have for lunch on Sunday?
Lunch on Sunday.
Well,
I went out with my youth pastor and his family.
Well, and you've already illustrated for me what I'm trying to talk about, and that is you broke eye contact with me. Because what were you doing when I asked that question?
I was trying to think back in my, replaying my...
And that's what questions do. Questions cause people to think. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that therapeutically, but if we look at developmentally where children are at, I'm not going to ask them something that will cause them to have to think. I mean, Scripture says that out of the heart spring the issues of life. And so I'm interested in staying at that heart level. And so I don't want to bring them up here because of what's happening developmentally.
Children are so no here and now. I mean, I had to think Sunday, where was I even on Sunday? And for children, Sunday...
it was a lifetime ago.
A lifetime ago,
yeah.
Right. They'll have a hard time remembering breakfast, maybe. Yeah. So they're very here and now, kind of.
So I won't... For instance, if I were to pick this up in the playroom and then ask you as a therapist, well, what's this?
In here it can be whatever you want it to be.
And now that kind of a response, very appropriate therapeutic response, then that allows me as a child to, oh, this is an airplane, and maybe zoom it around. But if you answer the question, then it can only be what you have prescribed it to be. And so when you do something like this in here, and of course that means in the play therapy room,
right.
This can be whatever I want it to be.
I'll give you an example of how children, and I think, well, let me back up and say, I think that one of the exciting things about toys is that it allows the children to do emotional and psychological distancing. So I'll give you an example. I had a little boy who came in for therapy. He was 3 years old, a single mom. He and mom had lived together his entire life. He had shared her bed. And then mom had a boyfriend who moved in. And the boyfriend, as we came to find out, was very aggressive, verbally aggressive. Mom never acknowledged that he was physically assaultive, but we know that he did like punch his hand through the walls and those kind of things. And this little boy stopped talking. And that's finally what brought mom to bring this little boy into play therapy. And in the sandbox, which is about 3 by 3 feet, he had a snake, a big T-Rex dinosaur, and a little teeny Gumby character. And he would have the snake and the Gumby character playing together in the sand. And he would sing, and he'd kind of give them little conversations like kids will. But then he would take this T-Rex dinosaur from outside the sandbox and have it go, roar, 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 into the sandbox. The snake would disappear, and here was this little Gumby character with this big T-Rex dinosaur. And again, it doesn't take a lot of insight to see that Snake was mom, the little boy was the T-Rex dinosaur, and here's this huge, big, aggressive, scary character. And so this little boy was able to play out these scenarios onto these toys in fantasy, but yet giving me a glimpse into what he felt like his life was like. And mom disappeared and wouldn't protect him. Yeah. So it's so exciting, I think, to see kids be able to do that kind of work. And then I could reflect things like, oh, that must be so scary for him. And I assumed it was a him because I was trying to make sure I thought it was the little boy. It must be so scary for him to be there with that really loud one, and that must be scary. And he'd look at me and he would just nod, and he'd have this like big look on his face. So I was entering his world and validating how he was feeling.
And who else in that child's world was doing that?
Nobody.
No one was doing
Nobody.
that. So he was able to express what was happening for him,
right.
His emotional responses, and you were entering into that for
exactly.
him. And that is going to touch that intrapsychic, that heart stuff, as opposed to saying, well, how do you feel? What was that like? What is it like living with mommy's boyfriend? And you could, if you peppered that child with questions, he may have been able to answer those questions in some limited way. And then you may think, okay, we're having a therapeutic moment.
Right.
But not like you were just describing.
Right, and also reflecting there's nobody there to protect him. And so letting him know that I understand that it's real scary. Scary to be there. So staying within the metaphor, too, as I have found, has been very, very effective.
Yeah. And also a very important thing that we do is reflect both the content and the feelings.
Yes.
Which is what you were doing in that demonstration. The content was that this scary toy was coming in, and the feeling was how scared that child was. And so there's words alone, a
Right.
verbal interchange will not reach that child's innermost parts like a play experience, which is the child's language.
Right. So also my tone of voice and my energy in my voice, that must be so scary, and that kind of thing. So, and then we find that in the process of therapy, they might go from using animals, or in that example, non-human figures, and then maybe moving, once they deal with it, so they can let down enough defenses to deal with it at that level.
So the animals create therapeutic distance.
Right.
And then that therapeutic distance creates that safety we were talking about.
And they can continue to try to sort out, what does all that mean? Then they can move sometimes to like the dollhouse and act it out in a different way using little human figures. And then they frequently have us do role playing, so with real adults, real people. I had a little girl who had observed her grandfather dying of a heart attack, who had me lay on the floor, and she would take the medical kit and she would bandage my head. Actually, it turned out that he did have a heart attack, but he fell and hit his head on a rock. And so she would bandage my head, and she would take the stethoscope and she would try to doctor me, but she would always say I was dead at the end of the session. And she just played that through until somehow she came to deal with the sense that her grandfather really died and the medical people couldn't do anything to save him. But she had to have a sense of, what was that like, and how did that feel, and all of that. So she was able to work through that whole issue by me being her dead grandfather.
We just have a few minutes left, so we want to wrap up. And of course, as we said before, and it's not really possible to provide intensive training in play therapy in a short videotape. But the importance of communicating, I'm going to use those four
All right.
words
Okay.
again. I'm here, I hear you, I understand, I care, which is what you were doing. You were communicating, I'm here with you. I hear what's going on, I understand, I care. And that in and of itself, and the child's able to communicate in his or her own medium of communication, provides that opportunity for that growth to occur,
Yes.
for that mastery and control that we were talking about to occur.
And I just think it's such a wonderful, almost sacred experience, like all counseling I believe is to be able to enter into a client's world to the level to really understand that empathy and really understand what that is all about.
Absolutely. And as you're talking about that, the Jungian part in me,
Yes.
there's the term called temenos, and it's the boundary between the sacred and the profane.
Yes.
The sacred being what's happening in the play therapy or the therapy experience, the profane basically the world outside. And we want that place to be a sacred place, a place where a child can feel safe enough to deal with the innermost hurts.
Whatever that happens to be.
Because if I'm asking a child, so tell me what it was like to be molested. Oh my goodness, I don't do that with adults.
Right.
And one point, and I wish I had more time to talk about this, but when it comes to children who've been traumatized, actually all clients who've been traumatized, oftentimes there's neurological issues that are happening. And there's been research that shows that the Broca's area of the brain, which is responsible for speech and language, shuts down as somebody recalls their trauma. But the limbic system, where the emotions are, goes up. And so to just talk doesn't make any sense, but to provide a nonverbal way. So to bypass, having to verbally, and that's actually with clients of any age.
Right.
But you talk about children developmentally where they're at, and then if they've experienced trauma, entering their world through play really is the way I believe to impact them the most.
And that's been my experience as well, working with children from lots of different kinds of presenting problems and why they're in the playroom, but the same kinds of experiences.
And then I'd like to close with a scripture. And this is Paul in 1 Corinthians 13:11. It's like this. When I was a child, I spoke and thought and reasoned as a child does. But when I grew up, I put away childish things. And we as adult therapists, we have presumably put away childish things, although
Right.
of course what we're talking about in play therapy is being childlike, not childish. But we have to remember our child clients haven't. They still speak and think and reason as children. And it would be totally inappropriate for an adult therapist to essentially say to a child, I'm not willing to enter your world. You leave your world of child communication and you enter my world of adult communication.
Well, for one thing, it's developmentally impossible. How does a child develop just in the playroom, cognitive skills and abstract thinking skills to be able to do that. So it's not only developmentally impossible, it's disrespectful and inappropriate.
So we appreciate you spending this time with us talking about play and play therapy. I want to encourage you one thing. Both Linda and I work with the Association for Play Therapy. Linda happens to be the current president, and I'm on the board. So I want to encourage you, if you want to know more about play therapy, and this information also will be in your written materials, www.a4pt.org. And we just really hope that you are encouraged to enter the child's world through play therapy. I think you will find it incredibly rewarding, both for you and for the children that you work with.